The common idea, then, is that the justice of God consists in punishing sin. It is in the hope of giving a larger idea of the justice of God in punishing sin that I ask, why is God bound to punish sin? How could he be a just God and not punish sin? Mercy is a good and right thing, I answer, and but for sin there could be no mercy. We are enjoined to forgive, to be merciful, to be as our Father in heaven. Two rights cannot possibly be opposed to each other. If God punished sin, it must be merciful to punish sin. And if God forgives sin, it must be just to forgive sin. We are required to forgive with the argument that our Father forgives. It must, I say, be right to forgive. Every attribute of God must be infinite as himself. He cannot be sometimes merciful and not always merciful. He cannot be just and not always just. Mercy belongs to him and needs no contrivance of theologic chicanery to justify it. Then you mean that it is wrong to punish sin, therefore God does not punish sin? By no means. God does punish sin. But there is no opposition between punishment and forgiveness. The one may be essential to the possibility of the other. Why, I repeat, does God punish sin? That is my point. Because in itself sin deserves punishment. Then how can he tell us to forgive it? He punishes, and having punished, he forgives. That will hardly do. If sin demands punishment, and the righteous punishment is given, then the man is free. Why should he be forgiven? He needs forgiveness because no amount of punishment will meet his deserts. I avoid for the present, as anyone may perceive, the probable expansion of this reply. Then why not forgive him at once, if the punishment is not essential, if part can be pretermitted? And again, can that be required which, according to your showing, is not adequate? You will perhaps answer, God may please to take what little he can have. And this brings me to the fault in the whole idea. Punishment is no wise an offset to sin. Foolish people sometimes, in a tone of self-gratulatory pity, will say, If I have sinned, I have suffered. Yes, verily. But what of that? What merit is there in it? Even had you laid the suffering upon yourself, what did you do to make up for the wrong? That you may have bettered by your suffering is well for you, but what atonement is there in the suffering? The notion is a false one altogether. Punishment, deserved suffering, is no equipoise to sin. It is no use laying it on the other scale. It will not move it a hair's breadth. Suffering weighs nothing at all against sin. It is not of the same kind, not under the same laws any more than mind and matter. We say a man deserves punishment, but when we forgive and do not punish him, we do not always feel that we have done wrong. Neither when we do punish him do we feel that any amends has been made for his wrongdoing. If it were an offset to wrong, then God would be bound to punish for the sake of punishment. But that cannot be, for God forgives. Then it is not for the sake of the punishment, as a thing that in itself ought to be done, but for the sake of something else, as a means to an end, that God punishes. It is not directly for justice, else how could he show mercy? For that would involve injustice. Primarily, God is not bound to punish sin. He is bound to destroy sin. If he were not the maker, he might not be bound to destroy sin. I do not know. But seeing he has created creatures who have sinned, and therefore sin has, by the creating act of God, come into the world, God is, in his own righteousness, bound to destroy sin. But that is to have no mercy. You mistake. God does destroy sin. He is always destroying sin. In him I trust that he is destroying sin in me. He is always saving the sinner from his sins, and that is destroying sin. But vengeance on the sinner, the law of a tooth for a tooth, is not in the heart of God, neither in his hand. If the sinner and the sin in him are the concrete object of the divine wrath, then indeed there can be no mercy. Then indeed there will be an end put to sin by the destruction of the sin and the sinner together. But thus would no atonement be wrought, nothing be done to make up for the wrong God has allowed to come into being by creating man. There must be an atonement, a making up, a bringing together, an atonement which, I say, cannot be made except by the man who has sinned. Punishment, I repeat, is not the thing required of God, but the absolute destruction of sin. What better is the world? What better is the sinner? What better is God? What better is the truth that the sinner should suffer, continue suffering to all eternity? Would there be less sin in the universe? Would there be any making up for sin? Would it show God justified in doing what he knew would bring sin into the world, justified in making creatures who he knew would sin? What setting right would come of the sinner's suffering? If justice demand it, if suffering be the equivalent for sin, then the sinner must suffer. Then God is bound to exact his suffering and not pardon. And so the making of man was a tyrannical deed, a creative cruelty. But grant that the sinner has deserved to suffer. No amount of suffering is any atonement for his sin. To suffer to all eternity could not make up for one unjust word. Does that mean, then, that for an unjust word I deserve to suffer to all eternity? The unjust word is an eternally evil thing. Nothing but God in my heart can cleanse me from the evil that uttered it. But does it follow that I saw the evil of what I did so perfectly that eternal punishment for it would be just? Sorrow and confession and self-abasing love will make up for the evil word. Suffering will not. For evil in the abstract, nothing can be done. It is eternally evil. But I may be saved from it by learning to loathe it, to hate it, to shrink from it with an eternal avoidance. The only vengeance worth having on sin is to make the sinner himself its executioner. Sin and punishment are in no antagonism to each other in man, any more than pardon and punishment are in God. They can perfectly coexist. The one naturally follows the other, punishment being born of sin, because evil exists only by the life of good and has no life of its own, being in itself death. Sin and suffering are not natural opposites. The opposite of evil is good, not suffering. The opposite of sin is not suffering, but righteousness. The path across the gulf that divides right from wrong is not the fire, but repentance. If my friend has wronged me, will it console me to see him punished? Will that be a rendering to me of my due? Will his agony be a balm to my deep wound? Should I be fit for any friendship, if that were possible even in regard to my enemy? But would not the shadow of repentant grief, the light of reviving love on his countenance, heal it at once, however deep? Take any of those wicked people in Dante's hell, and ask wherein is justice served by their punishment. Mind, I am not saying it is not right to punish them. I am saying that justice is not, never can be, satisfied by suffering. Nay, cannot have any satisfaction in or from suffering. Human resentment, human revenge, human hate may. Such justice as Dante's keeps wickedness alive in its most terrible forms. The life of God goes forth to inform, or at least give a home to, victorious evil. Is he not defeated every time that one of those lost souls defies him? All hell cannot make Vanni Fucci say, "I was wrong." God is triumphantly defeated, I say, throughout the hell of his vengeance. Although against evil, it is but the vain and wasted cruelty of a tyrant. There is no destruction of evil thereby, but an enhancing of its horrible power in the midst of the most agonizing and disgusting tortures a divine imagination can invent. If sin must be kept alive, then hell must be kept alive. But while I regard the smallest sin as infinitely loathsome, I do not believe that any being, never good enough to see the essential ugliness of sin, could sin so as to deserve such punishment. I am not now, however, dealing with the question of the duration of punishment, but with the idea of punishment itself, and would only say in passing that the notion that a creature born imperfect, nay, born with impulses to evil not of his own generating, and which he could not help having, a creature to whom the true face of God was never presented, and by whom it never could have been seen, should be thus condemned, is as loathsome a lie against God as could find place in heart too undeveloped to understand what justice is, and too low to look up into the face of Jesus. It never in truth found place in any heart, though in many a pettifogging brain. There is but one thing lower than deliberately to believe such a lie, and that is to worship the God of whom it is believed. The one deepest, highest, truest, fittest, most wholesome suffering must be generated in the wicked by a vision, a true sight, more or less adequate, of the hideousness of their lives, of the horror of the wrongs they have done. Physical suffering may be a factor in rousing this mental pain, but "I would I had never been born" must be the cry of Judas, not because of the hellfire around him, but because he loathes the man that betrayed his friend, the world's friend. When a man loathes himself, he has begun to be saved. Punishment tends to this result, not for its own sake, not as a make-up for sin, not for divine revenge, horrible word, not for any satisfaction to justice, can punishment exist. Punishment is for the sake of amendment and atonement. God is bound by his love to punish sin in order to deliver his creature. He is bound by his justice to destroy sin in his creation. Love is justice, is the fulfilling of the law for God as well as for his children. This is the reason of punishment. This is why justice requires that the wicked shall not go unpunished, that they, through the eye-opening power of pain, may come to see and do justice, may be brought to desire and make all possible amends, and so become just. Such punishment concerns justice in the deepest degree. For justice, that is, God, is bound in himself to see justice done by his children, not in the mere outward act, but in their very being. He is bound in himself to make up for wrong done by his children, and he can do nothing to make up for wrong done but by bringing about the repentance of the wrongdoer. When the man says, "I did wrong, I hate myself and my deed, I cannot endure to think that I did it," then, I say, is atonement begun. Without that, all that the Lord did would be lost. He would have made no atonement. Repentance, restitution, confession, prayer for forgiveness, righteous dealing thereafter is the sole possible, the only true make-up for sin. For nothing less than this did Christ die. When a man acknowledges the right he denied before, when he says to the wrong, "I abjure, I loathe you. I see now what you are. I could not see it before because I would not. God forgive me, make me clean, or let me die." Then justice, that is God, has conquered, and not till then.